A British Rail supervisor named Derek Wilson stood on the platform at Leeds Central Station, watching ice form on the overhead wires, minus 18 degrees Celsius. Standard procedure said wait for the maintenance crew to de-ice the catenary before running services. The maintenance crew was on strike. Wilson had a choice: shut down the entire Northern Rail network or improvise. In the next 72 hours, over 2 million commuters would be stranded, 43 people would die from hypothermia, and the British government would fall. This is the story of how the coldest winter in 16 years collided with the largest strike wave since 1926 and paralysed a nation. The winter of discontent didn't begin with winter. It began in the autumn of 1978, when the Labour government of James Callaghan announced a 5% pay cap. Inflation was running at 8%. For workers whose wages had been frozen for 3 years, the mathematics was simple: accept a pay cut in real terms, or strike. The lorry drivers walked out first, then the railway workers, then the dustmen, the gravediggers, the school caretakers, the hospital porters, the water workers, and the ambulance crews. By December, 1.5 million workers were either on strike or operating work to rule. Then the weather turned. On the 29th of December 1978, an Arctic high-pressure system settled over northern Scotland. Temperatures in the Highlands dropped to minus 15. Not unusual for December. What happened next was unusual. The high-pressure system didn't move. It sat over Britain like a lead weight, pulling cold air down from the Arctic for 8 consecutive weeks. By the 2nd of January, temperatures across England had dropped to levels not seen since 1963. By the 10th of January, Carnwath in South Lanarkshire recorded minus 24.6 degrees Celsius, the coldest temperature measured anywhere in the United Kingdom during the entire decade of the 1970s. The snow started on the 3rd of January, 6 inches overnight in Yorkshire, 9 inches in Wales, 12 inches across the Scottish lowlands. Under normal circumstances, the response would have been immediate. Council gritting lorries on the motorways, British Rail maintenance crews clearing points and signals, contractors with snowplows opening the secondary roads. But the lorry drivers were on strike. The railway maintenance crews were on strike. The council workers were on strike. The snow stayed where it fell. On the 4th of January, the M62 Transpennine motorway closed. Too much snow, no gritters. Traffic diverted to the A628 Woodhead Pass. The A628 closed 6 hours later. By nightfall, the only road connection between Manchester and Sheffield was a single-track farm road near Holmfirth, passable only by Land Rover. The Daily Mirror ran the headline, "Britain cut in two." They weren't exaggerating. By the end of the first week of January, over 400 miles of A roads were impassable. The M6 was open only between Lancaster and Preston. The A1, Britain's main north-south artery, was blocked in 17 separate locations between Newcastle and Edinburgh. The problem wasn't just the volume of snow. The problem was the temperature. Minus 12, minus 15, minus 18 degrees across most of northern England. Salt doesn't work below minus 10. Grit doesn't work below minus 15. Even if the council workers hadn't been on strike, even if the lorries had been running, the standard winter maintenance procedures were useless. The cold was too deep. The snow turned to ice. The ice turned to compacted ridges 3 feet high across entire motorway lanes, and nobody had equipment designed to shift it. On the 6th of January, a coal delivery lorry jackknifed on the M1 near Nottingham. The driver wasn't a striker. He was an independent haulier trying to deliver fuel to a hospital. His lorry blocked both southbound lanes. Under normal circumstances, a recovery vehicle would have cleared it within 2 hours, but the recovery drivers were on strike. The lorry sat there for 11 days, traffic backed up for 14 miles. On the 9th day, a family of 4, Peter and Margaret Foster, aged 53 and 51, their son David, aged 27, and his wife Susan, aged 25, ran out of petrol in the queue. They kept the engine running for heat until the tank was empty. They were found on the morning of the 17th, all 4 dead from exposure. The outside temperature when they were discovered was minus 16 degrees Celsius. The railway network fared no better. On the 7th of January, the overnight sleeper service from London Euston to Glasgow Central left on time. Standard consist: 1 Class 40 diesel locomotive, 12 Mark II coaches, 340 passengers. The train made it as far as Beatock Summit in Dumfriesshire. Elevation, 1,015 feet above sea level. At 0230 hours, the locomotive hit a snowdrift blocking the line. The driver, Thomas McAvoy, aged 49, applied the brakes. The train stopped. The snow was 8 feet deep across both tracks for a distance of approximately 200 yards. McAvoy radioed for assistance. British Rail maintenance teams were on strike. No help available. Instructions from control: sit tight, wait for conditions to improve. The passengers waited. For 36 hours. The heating failed after 6 hours. The locomotive's diesel tank ran dry with the engine idling. Outside temperature -21 degrees Celsius. Inside temperature in the unheated coaches -8. 3 passengers, Sarah Collins, age 72, James Morton, age 68, and Elizabeth Ward, age 74, died of hypothermia before a Royal Air Force helicopter could reach them on the morning of the 9th of January. The helicopter could only take 12 passengers per trip. It made 19 trips. The last passenger was evacuated 42 hours after the train had stopped. The train itself sat at Beattock Summit until the 28th of January, when the snow finally melted enough to clear the line. By the 10th of January, 93 separate communities across Scotland, Wales and northern England were completely cut off by road. No food deliveries, no fuel deliveries, no mail. The Army deployed Westland Wessex helicopters from RAF Oldham to drop emergency supplies. Flight Lieutenant Andrew Davies, age 34, flew one of the first missions, dropping powdered milk, tinned meat and paraffin heaters to the village of Alston in Cumbria, population 870. Davies made 4 trips on the 10th of January, 6 trips on the 11th, 8 trips on the 12th. On the 13th, his helicopter developed mechanical trouble. No spare parts available. The maintenance contractors were on strike. Davies's helicopter sat grounded for 9 days while Alston ran out of heating oil. The strikes continued. On the 14th of January, 1.9 million workers were either on strike or work to rule. Hospital porters in London refused to handle emergency patients. Gravediggers in Liverpool refused to bury the dead. Bodies piled up in a temporary morgue at the city's Speke Airport. Dustmen in Birmingham refused to collect rubbish. Bin bags accumulated on pavements, some piles reaching 8 feet high, and the snow kept falling. Another 6 inches on the 15th, 8 inches on the 17th, 12 inches on the 19th. The country was shutting down. On the 20th of January, Prime Minister James Callaghan returned from a conference in Guadeloupe. At Heathrow Airport, a journalist asked him about the mounting crisis. Callaghan's response: "I don't think other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos." The Sun newspaper ran the headline the next morning: "Crisis? What crisis?" Callaghan never actually said those words. It didn't matter. The phrase stuck. The government looked detached. The workers looked greedy. The country looked paralysed. And the temperature kept dropping. On the 22nd of January, Glasgow City Council declared a state of emergency. Rubbish uncollected for 3 weeks. Water mains frozen and burst across the city. 37 separate failures. Roads impassable. Schools closed. Hospitals operating at 50% capacity because staff couldn't get to work. The Scottish Office estimated that 90,000 people in Glasgow had no running water. Another 120,000 had intermittent supply. Tanker lorries could have brought emergency water from reservoirs in the Trossachs, but the tanker drivers were on strike. The breaking point came on the 24th of January. The public sector unions called a coordinated strike, the largest single-day walkout in British history since the General Strike of 1926. 1.5 million workers, schools closed, hospitals operating emergency-only protocols, rail services shut down except for a skeleton freight network, and the weather got worse. -19 degrees in Newcastle, -22 in Aberdeen, -24.6 in Carnwath. That record still stands. The coldest temperature ever reliably recorded in the United Kingdom during the 1970s. By the end of January, the economic cost was becoming clear. British Steel estimated losses of £200 million. British Leyland estimated losses of £90 million. British Rail estimated losses of £65 million. The Treasury estimated total economic damage at approximately £1.1 billion, roughly equivalent to 1% of annual GDP. But the political cost was higher. On the 7th of February, Margaret Thatcher stood in the House of Commons and delivered a speech that would define the next decade of British politics. She didn't mention the strikes directly. She mentioned the train stuck in snowdrifts with no rescue. She mentioned the roads blocked for weeks with no clearance. She mentioned the bodies piled up in Liverpool because nobody would dig the graves. She mentioned the pensioners freezing to death in tower blocks because nobody would deliver the coal. Then she said, "The government has lost control. The country needs leadership. We will provide it." The vote of no confidence came on the 28th of March 1979. The Callaghan government fell by a single vote, 311 to 310. The general election was called for the 3rd of May. The Conservative Party campaign didn't focus on economic policy or tax rates or foreign affairs. It focused on a single image: Britain in winter, snow on the streets, rubbish on the pavements, bodies in makeshift morgues, trains frozen on the tracks. The slogan was simple: Labour isn't working. On the 4th of May, Margaret Thatcher won with a majority of 43 seats. The winter of discontent was over. The Thatcher era had begun. The snow melted in early March. The strikes ended throughout April and May, some with negotiated settlements, some with workers simply returning to work, exhausted and broke. The trains at Beatock Summit were finally cleared on the 28th of January. The M62 reopened on the 19th of February. The water mains in Glasgow were repaired by mid-March. Life returned to normal, but something had changed. The winter of 1979 killed 91 people, 63 from hypothermia, 17 in traffic accidents on icy roads, 11 in house fires caused by improvised heating, the coldest winter in 16 years, the largest strike wave in 53 years, and the two happened at exactly the same time. Coincidence or something deeper? Historians still argue. What's not arguable is the outcome. The strikes paralysed the country, the snow made the paralysis visible, and the British electorate drew conclusions. Derek Wilson, the supervisor at Leeds Central Station, never did figure out how to de-ice those overhead wires without a maintenance crew. He shut down the Northern Rail network on the 2nd of January 1979. It didn't fully reopen until the 9th of February, 38 days. But Wilson kept one thing running: a single diesel locomotive hauling emergency freight. Food, medicine, coal for hospitals. No overhead wires required. He drove it himself. 18-hour shifts, 7 days a week, for 5 weeks. When asked later why he did it, Wilson said, "Somebody had to." That phrase appears nowhere in the official histories of the winter of discontent, but it captures something the statistics miss. Amid the strikes and the snow and the political collapse, ordinary people did what they could. It wasn't enough to save the government. It was barely enough to save the country, but it was something. The winter of discontent ended the post-war consensus in British politics. The idea that government, unions and employers could work together for the common good. It ended the idea that strikes were a legitimate tool of collective bargaining. It ended the idea that public sector workers deserved protection from market forces, and it ended the career of James Callaghan, a decent man caught between forces he couldn't control, his own party's left wing demanding higher wages, his treasury demanding fiscal restraint, and an Arctic winter that didn't care about either. 45 years later, the images remain. Snow piled 6 feet high on the M62. Rubbish rotting on London pavements. Bodies waiting for burial in Liverpool. Trains frozen at Beatock Summit. And Margaret Thatcher in the Commons pointing at the chaos and saying, "We can do better." Whether she was right is still debated. What's certain is that 1979 was the hinge. Before, the post-war settlement, strong unions, government intervention, collective bargaining. After, privatisation, deregulation, individual responsibility, market discipline. The winter of discontent didn't just change a government, it changed a country. And it all started with Derek Wilson standing on a frozen platform at 400 hours on the 2nd of January, watching ice form on wires that nobody would clear. He made a choice. Millions of others made choices. The country made a choice. Some decisions are made in committee rooms and cabinet meetings. Some are made on frozen railway platforms at 4 a.m. Both kinds matter. 1979 taught Britain that lesson. The country is still learning it.